This image never should have been seen, and once I saw it, I understood why more than 1,000 people never made it home. I stood there for several minutes, staring at that frozen frame, trying to convince myself my eyes were lying, that it was just a trick of the light, a shadow at the wrong angle, anything other than what was actually there. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became. Someone had been dragged off the trail, and it wasn't a normal animal. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't an accident. I know that when people talk about hikers who go missing, most minds jump straight to carelessness, someone being reckless, getting lost, falling, slipping, making one bad decision. I used to think that too. For a long time, that explanation felt good enough. Trails are dangerous. Nature doesn't forgive. One mistake, and it's over. But that story starts falling apart when you realize how many people simply vanish. No body, no clothes, no trace that makes sense. Over 1,000 hikers have disappeared over the decades. Seasoned hikers and first-timers, young and older, alone or with others. Some within a few yards of main paths, others in places that are heavily visited and routinely monitored. The pattern was never obvious enough to stay in the headlines, but it was never random enough to be ignored by anyone willing to look closely. I wasn't even searching for answers when I found that recording. Honestly, I shouldn't have had access to it at all. It was just another file buried among hundreds of trail camera captures, the kind used to track wildlife, foot traffic, changes in the environment. A basic piece of gear, forgotten out in the woods, doing its quiet job, until the day it captured something that shouldn't exist. What shook me most wasn't just the figure in the image. It was the behavior. There was no panic, no chaos, no sign of an attack. There was method. There was intention. Something was being removed from the path, like it wasn't meant to be found, like someone or something was making sure that body would never be located. At this point, I need to ask you for one thing. Before I continue, write in the comments where you're watching from: city, state, country. It doesn't matter where you live, because this story doesn't belong to one place. It crosses borders, forests, parks, and trails all over the world. People disappear in silence in a lot of different places, and almost always the official explanation is the same: accident, human error, bad luck. But what if it isn't just that? The more I dug into it, the harder it became to ignore the weight of those numbers. 1,000 people don't vanish into thin air. 1,000 families don't end up without answers by coincidence. 1,000 stories don't end in absolute silence unless something is behind it. And that's where it starts to get uncomfortable, because accepting that possibility means admitting the forest might not just be a passive backdrop where bad things happen by chance. There's a comforting narrative most of us grow up with, that we're the ones in control, the explorers, the ones who go in, map it, document it, and walk back out. That story protects us from fear. It lets us believe that if something went wrong, it's because someone messed up. But that trail cam image doesn't fit that logic. It suggests something else, something that moves when nobody's watching, something that doesn't leave traces by accident, but by choice. Out of all the cases tied to this pattern, one in particular never left my mind. Maybe because she was close to my age. Maybe because her photos are still out there online, smiling, alive, looking like someone you could pass on the street anywhere. Her name was Joan. She was 32 when she disappeared. Before she vanished, Joan was just another everyday person who loved hiking. No extreme behavior, no dangerous challenges, nothing that would explain what happened afterward. She went out on a trail the way thousands of people do. Every single day, she told someone where she was going. She had basic gear. She had enough experience not to get turned around easily. And still, she never came back. What happened to Joan isn't an isolated case. It's one piece of something much bigger, something that starts to make sense when you line all these disappearances up side by side. And when you add one real image into that equation captured by a camera that doesn't lie, the story stops being merely strange. It becomes impossible to ignore. I know a lot of people will want to click away right here, say this is exaggerated, that it's just theory. That's easier than accepting the possibility that something is being systematically covered up, not by a human conspiracy, but by a presence that understands the territory better than we do. A presence that knows exactly where we're vulnerable. If you choose to stay to the end, I'm going to show you how that image connects to decades of disappearances. I'm going to tell you who Joan was before she became just another name on a list. And I'm going to explain why, after seeing what that camera recorded, I've never been able to look at a hiking trail the same way again. None of this ends here. In fact, this is only just beginning. When I started laying these cases side by side, the first thing that scared me wasn't any single disappearance. It was the repetition. The same details kept showing up again and again, like someone was telling the same story with different names. Experienced hikers vanishing on well-marked trails. People who told family, friends, even park staff where they'd be. People who left early, in stable weather, with basic gear, and then simply stopped existing past a certain point on the path. Over the decades, more than 1,000 people have gone missing under those conditions. Not in one isolated spot, but across different areas that share the same traits. Vast state and national parks, dense forests, trails that seem far too safe for someone to disappear without a trace. We're not talking about remote, extreme, unreachable wilderness. We're talking about trails used every day by tourists, locals, and families. What makes the pattern even more unsettling is the kind of people it affects. Most of them don't fit the picture of someone unprepared. Many had experience, knew how to read maps, understood their limits. Some vanished minutes from open areas. Others were last seen walking normally. No panic, no reports of anything strange. In many cases, the trail just kept going, as if nothing had happened. When you look at these disappearances one at a time, the official explanation almost always sounds reasonable. A slip, a wrong turn, a sudden change in weather, a basic human mistake. But that story starts to fail when you realize bodies are rarely found, especially in places where, in theory, something should turn up eventually, even years later, even by accident. Search teams describe the same frustration over and over. Dogs that lose the scent abruptly. Areas combed for days, weeks, months, without finding clothing, backpacks, or human remains. In some cases, personal items show up in strange places, almost like they were placed there later. In others, nothing shows up. Absolutely nothing. Authorities often close these cases with short, simple conclusions. Probable accident, exposure, disorientation, and the investigation stops there. Not out of cruelty, but because accepting a different explanation would mean admitting something is out of control of something that doesn't fit the standard playbook. Something you can't neatly explain at a press conference. If you've ever heard about people who just disappear on trails, type the word vanished in the comments. Not to agree with me, just to mark how many times you've seen this story brush past you, even from a distance, as a quick headline or a half-forgotten conversation. Another thing that repeats is the silence afterward. Families are left without real answers. Communities move on. The case goes cold. And then another disappearance happens in another park, on another trail, at another point on the map. Always far enough apart that it doesn't become one massive scandal, but close enough to keep feeding the same uncomfortable question. Over time, I started to see that these disappearances don't feel random. They follow a strange logic, almost territorial. Certain parks have more cases than others. Certain trails carry the same history over and over, and yet they stay open. They stay busy. They stay recommended in travel guides. Like the danger is invisible, impossible to warn people about without sounding dramatic. There's also a psychological pattern that almost never gets discussed. Before some people disappear, they describe sensations that are hard to explain. A wrong kind of silence. The feeling of being watched. A discomfort that doesn't become full-blown panic, but shows up later in texts, notes, or survivor accounts. None of that makes it into official reports. It gets treated as subjective, irrelevant. If all of this were fiction, you could chalk it up to coincidence. But when you see the numbers, when you understand the geographic spread, when you realize the same pattern repeats across different places and different cultures with different people. It becomes harder and harder to call it nothing but bad luck. And this is where the story starts moving dangerously close to what that trail camera recorded, because one thing is imagining someone getting lost. Another very different thing is considering the possibility that these bodies don't disappear by accident, but because they're removed, not left behind, not abandoned, taken off the path. I know that idea creates resistance. It breaks the comfortable logic we've learned to accept, but ignoring it doesn't make the numbers go away. If anything, they keep growing quietly, year after year. And in the meantime, the trails stay crowded. Photos keep getting taken. Goodbyes keep happening at trailheads, with everyone believing everything will be fine. If this part of the story is already getting under your skin, right? This isn't normal in the comments. Because it isn't. And what's most disturbing is that among all these cases, some eventually reveal details that shouldn't exist, details that connect numbers to faces, statistics to real people. That's exactly what happened when I reached Joan's case. Because unlike so many other disappearances, hers left enough traces to show that something didn't fit any official explanation. And when those traces collide with that trail cam image, the pattern stops being purely statistical. It becomes personal. And from this point on, the story changes scale. Because understanding who Joan was and how her disappearance fits into a much bigger pattern is what starts giving shape to what had looked like nothing more than a collection of unsettling numbers. Joan was 32 when she disappeared, and it matters to say that right up front, because 32 isn't reckless youth, and it isn't fragile old age. It's a stage of life when most people know who they are, what they enjoy, which risks are worth taking and which aren't. Joan wasn't chasing adrenaline. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was ordinary in the most real way, and that might be exactly why her story hit so hard. The photos she left behind make that obvious. Simple pictures, some smiling at the camera, others caught in everyday moments. No extreme poses, no dangerous scenery, photos that could belong to anyone you know. She had family. She had routines. She had plans that didn't involve vanishing into the woods. She loved hiking because she loved quiet, because she liked walking, because it made her feel grounded. For her, the trail wasn't an escape. It was balance. When you look at Joan's life before she disappeared, you don't find signs of someone careless. She did the basics. She told people where she was going. She respected boundaries. She wasn't the kind of person who sneaks into restricted areas or ignores warnings. If anything, she was the opposite. And that's exactly why her case never fit neatly into the official explanations that came afterward. Her family always described Joan as careful, not just with herself, but with others. She'd call to say she arrived. She'd text. She'd share her location when it made sense. That may sound small, but it matters when you're trying to understand how someone like that could vanish without leaving a trace. Careful people leave footprints. Attentive people leave clues. In her case, there was nothing. All that remained were ordinary belongings, ordinary memories, and an absence that never got filled. No call for help, no strange message, no report of conflict, just a stretch of time that opened up and never closed again. That emptiness is what turns Joan into something bigger than a single case. She becomes a quiet symbol of everything we can't explain. If you're hearing this and you can picture someone you love in her place, write the word someone in the comments, because that's how this story works. The more ordinary the person is, the easier it is to see yourself there. And the easier it is to see yourself there, the harder it is to accept that it happened for no reason at all. The search for Joan followed the familiar script: volunteers, specialized teams, days of hope that collapse into frustration. Every hour that passed lowered the odds of finding her alive, but even then, no one was prepared for what they didn't find. No clear sign of a fall, no evidence of an animal attack, no indication she'd become completely disoriented. The cruelest part of these cases isn't just the loss, it's the suspension. Her family didn't have a body to bury. They didn't have definitive answers. They lived in a kind of waiting room that never closes, and it eats away at you. Because when there's no clear explanation, every possibility stays alive, including the most disturbing ones. Joan became a statistic for people who analyzed numbers, but she never stopped being a person to the people who knew her. And that's where the gap between official paperwork and human reality becomes impossible to miss. A report says, missing. A family lives every day with the concrete absence of that specific person, her voice, her presence, the space she took up that can't be replaced. That contrast between what gets written on paper and what gets lived in real life shows up in countless trail disappearances. But in Joan's case, there's one detail that changes everything. The moment her disappearance starts to overlap in time and place with the existence of that trail camera I mentioned earlier. I'm not saying the image shows Joan, that has to be clear, but the context around it starts lining up in a way that's hard to shake. Same general region, same logic of disappearance, same total lack of meaningful traces. When you put those pieces together, the story stops being only sad, it becomes unsettling. If up to now you believed this was just another story about someone who got lost, write, "I thought so," in the comments. Because that's the most common reaction, and it's the reaction that starts changing once you realize Joan wasn't the only one, or the first, or the last. What happened to her didn't just interrupt one life. It fit into a pattern that's still active, a pattern that doesn't pick reckless, thrill seekers, but ordinary people. People who step into the woods believing they'll be home by the end of the day. And that's exactly why understanding who Joan was matters so much. Because the more human she becomes in our eyes, the more impossible it is to accept simple explanations. And once you stop accepting simple explanations, the story starts demanding answers that no one seems willing to give. That's when we have to look closely at the exact day Joan disappeared. Because in the ordinary details of that last hike, there are signs that only make sense once you already know something is deeply wrong. On the day Joan disappeared, nothing seemed out of place. The time was normal for her, early enough to avoid crowds, late enough to catch the light she liked. The weather cooperated. No rain in the forecast, a light breeze, temperatures right where they should be. Everything pointed to a calm day, the kind that doesn't leave a mark because nothing goes wrong. She chose a familiar trail listed on official maps, used by plenty of people with clear landmarks. It wasn't isolated. It wasn't improvised. It wasn't the kind of place where someone would vanish easily. Joan had walked trails like that before. It wasn't new. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't impulsive. It was routine. Before she left, she did what she always did. She told someone. She texted where she'd be, mentioned roughly when she'd be back, said it shouldn't take long. Nothing in those messages sounded rushed, scared, or hesitant. If anything, they were light, ordinary, almost automatic, the kind of messages that only become heavy after something goes wrong. The people close to her remember that detail clearly, because it's impossible not to replay every word when someone disappears. Every sentence becomes a clue. Every timestamp becomes a reference point. And that day, everything lined up. She went in when she said she would. She was seen near the start of the trail. She greeted strangers, kept walking, gradually vanished between the trees like any other hiker. The first stretch of trail wasn't threatening at all. Open path, steady ground, clear signage. No reports of aggressive animals. No active warnings, no closures. Nothing that would justify a sudden detour or a risky decision. Joan just kept going. At some point, the messages stopped, not abruptly, but naturally, the way it happens when someone walks into a dead zone. That alone didn't set off alarms right away. It was expected. Trails do that. The problem was, the signal never came back with the message everyone was waiting for, the confirmation that she was off the trail and on her way home. Time passed, first minutes, then hours. Expectation turned into quiet concern. No one panics immediately. The mind tries to explain it away. Maybe she stopped. Maybe she ran into someone. Maybe she decided to extend the hike. Those possibilities don't last long when the evening starts to fall and the phone stays silent. The exact moment Joan should have returned became a landmark, not because of an alarm, but because of the void. No call, no notification, no update, just silence. And in stories like this, silence is never neutral. It weighs on you. It grows. It changes everything. When concern shifted into real alarm, the first attempts to reach her weren't working anymore. Calls wouldn't connect. Messages wouldn't deliver. The trail just hours earlier, nothing more than a normal route, turned into a question mark on the map. The searches started quickly, but they're always late compared to what matters most. People retraced her route. Eyes scanned the ground. Her name echoed through the trees with no answer. Flashlights swept over branches, rocks, drop-offs. All the things that, in movies, lead to a resolution. In real life, they often lead to more questions. There were no obvious signs of a fall, no clear marks of a struggle, no belongings scattered in a way that made sense. The trail kept going as if no one had passed through. That detail gets minimized, but it matters to anyone who investigates disappearances like this. People leave traces. Even when something goes wrong, something usually remains. In Joan's case, what frightened everyone most was interrupted normalcy. She didn't vanish in chaos. She vanished on an ordinary day, in an ordinary place, doing something ordinary. And that breaks the belief that only people who take extreme risks end up disappearing. If you've ever had that uneasy feeling that something simple could go wrong without warning, write "It could have been me" in the comments, because that's exactly the kind of identification that makes this day so unsettling. The next hours became hard to describe. Every minute felt longer than the last. Every sound in the woods felt like a possibility. Every hiker they ran into became a spark of hope, but Joan didn't appear. The trail gave everyone back except her. When night fully set in, the search took on a different weight. What had been late became an official missing person case. And with that came the protocols, the reports, the standardized assumptions, disorientation, possible accident, possible departure from the trail. Generic terms used to give shape to something nobody could truly explain. What's most unsettling is that even in those early hours, some of the people involved in the search mentioned feelings they couldn't put into words. A different kind of silence. A sense that something didn't fit. Nothing solid enough to go into an official report, but real enough to stick in memory. That was the day Joan stopped being just an ordinary person out for a hike and became part of that quiet list of names that grows year after year. The day everything felt normal until it didn't. The day no one noticed the exact moment things slipped out of control. And while everyone tried to figure out where Joan might have gotten lost, there was something nobody knew yet. A detail that wasn't on the maps, wasn't in the witness accounts, and didn't belong to any official explanation. Something that would surface later when a forgotten trail camera deep in the woods revealed that, during that same period, someone or something had been moving along those trails in a way nobody expected. The searches began fast, at least fast enough to follow procedure. Official teams were called in, volunteers showed up, scent dogs hit the trail within the first hours. People who'd never met walked side by side, scanning the ground and the trees for anything that might show where Joan went after the last known point. At first, there was still hope. There always is. The idea that she could be hurt, sheltering from the cold, waiting for help, kept people moving through that forest. The dogs followed the initial trail easily. The scent was there, strong and clear. That always brings a brief sense of relief, because it means there's a path to follow. But that relief doesn't last in cases like this. At one specific point on the trail, the scent simply stopped. It didn't fade gradually. It didn't spread out. It ended. Like Joan had evaporated in that exact spot. That detail was treated as normal in the reports. Difficult terrain, environmental interference, wind, moisture. Technical explanations that sound reasonable on paper. But anyone who has watched searches like this unfold knows those explanations don't always match what it feels like on the ground. A scent that ends abruptly always leaves a strange chill, even for experienced professionals. The searches stretched into days. The same areas were combed again and again. Drop-offs, waterways, clearings, off-trail sections. Nothing. No clothing. No backpack. No personal items. Not even something small that might suggest a fall or a struggle to stay conscious. The landscape stayed too intact for someone who supposedly got lost or had an accident. Volunteers started talking quietly about what never makes it into official paperwork, how strange the place felt, how long the silence lasted, the sense of being watched at certain points on the trail. None of it was said officially, but it hung in the air inside conversations, in glances exchanged when nobody was filming or taking notes. If you've ever heard about searches that end with no answers, right? They never found her in the comments. Because that phrase shows up with an unsettling frequency when you talk about missing hikers. As time went on, the human presence started to thin out. Volunteers had to return to their lives. Official teams reduced the perimeter. Active searching turned into monitoring, and monitoring eventually became waiting. That's how many of these cases officially die, not with a conclusion, but with collective exhaustion. What stands out is how often this pattern repeats. A huge push at the beginning, a surge of effort, and then an absolute void of results. And once again, no body. In places where, statistically, something should show up eventually, even after a long time. In rivers, on slopes, in dense brush. But here, nothing. Some independent researchers have called that an anomaly. It isn't normal for human remains to never be found in so many similar cases. Even animal attacks leave evidence. Even serious falls usually leave something behind. Total disappearance, repeated again and again, starts to feel less like an accident and more like a pattern of removal. Official explanations avoid that word. Removal implies action, intention, something beyond chance. That's why reports lean on vague, open-ended language that doesn't demand deeper questions. But for anyone who follows these cases closely, the ongoing absence of bodies becomes impossible to ignore. Families get trapped in a cruel limbo. Without proof of death, there's no closure. Without closure, there's no peace. Every new search announcement reignites hope that almost never turns into answers. And meanwhile, the list of missing keeps growing quietly, spread across different regions, but tied together by the same emptiness. In some cases, years later, personal items appear in places that had already been searched. That gets written off as human error in the early searches. But when it happens repeatedly, the explanation starts to feel weak. How can something show up somewhere so obvious after so much time? Why does it look too clean, too preserved, too out of place? If that feels off to you, write "something's wrong" in the comments, because that's the exact feeling that starts taking shape when you follow these stories without filters. In Joan's case, the search officially ended without answers. No conclusive evidence, no definitive indication of what happened. Only possibilities. And this is where the human threat enters, not as a villain, but as a limit. Because admitting we don't know what happens on these trails is something institutions avoid. The unknown scares people more than any simple explanation, even a false one. But the unknown doesn't disappear just because we don't talk about it. It stays there, between the trees, on the trails that remain open, on the maps that keep getting printed and handed out. And in rare cases, it gets captured by accident, by a forgotten camera, by a device that doesn't feel fear, doesn't have an agenda, doesn't choose what it shows. That's exactly where the story stops being only about failed searches and becomes something far more disturbing. Because when a trail camera records something that contradicts every official explanation, the question stops being "where is she?" and becomes "who's to say?" Anyone ever wanted her found? The trail camera wasn't installed to look for missing people. That matters, because it completely changes the weight of what it recorded. It was there for something ordinary, almost boring, tracking wildlife movement, documenting environmental patterns, maybe supporting basic studies or hunting management. A simple piece of equipment, the kind that sits for months in the same spot, firing off hundreds of meaningless images that hardly anyone reviews closely. It was mounted in a seemingly normal area, near a secondary trail, in a place where the sensor usually tripped for deer, small animals, or even the wind shaking low branches. Nothing about that location suggested anything extraordinary could happen there. No official history of attacks. No special warnings. No unusual restrictions. Just woods, trail, and quiet. For weeks, maybe months, the camera did exactly what it was supposed to do. Repetitive photos. Predictable times. Familiar patterns. Animals passing by. Shadows crossing the frame. Leaves falling. The kind of footage most people delete without a second thought, just to clear space on the memory card. The kind of footage that only becomes important when something breaks routine. The sensor triggered at a time that wouldn't mean anything on its own. Not the dead of night, not full daylight. One of those windows when the forest is still active, but already starting to go still. The camera fired like it always did. No warning, no intention, no choice. What showed up in the frame wasn't understood right away. The first people who saw it thought it might be an error, a strange overlap, maybe a larger animal caught from a bad angle. The image wasn't clean. It wasn't sharp. It didn't look like it was made to be studied. It was an imperfect frame, slightly blurred, poorly composed. Exactly what you expect from a cheap automatic camera. But something in it didn't match any normal explanation. A shape too large for anything known in the area. Movement that didn't look chaotic or instinctive. There was direction. There was weight. Something was being pulled off the path. That's the kind of detail your brain tries to dismiss first. It reaches for shortcuts. It searches for something familiar. Bear, elk, a trick of perspective. Anything that keeps you from facing the possibility that it doesn't fit any of those categories. But the longer you look, the harder it becomes to keep those explanations standing. The camera didn't capture an attack. That needs to be said. There's no sprinting, no struggle, no explicit violence. What exists is movement. A limp body being removed from the trail. And that changes everything. Predators attack. Animals react. Here, what's recorded is different. The figure in the image seems to know exactly where it's going. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't look around. It doesn't show urgency. It simply carries out an action, as if it's routine, as if that route is familiar, as if that gesture has happened before. If you've been following along, and you feel like this has already crossed the line of what's normal, right? This is disturbing in the comments, because that word starts to come naturally once you understand what that camera showed. Another detail is the framing. The body appears partially outside the shot, like the camera triggered a few seconds too late. That reinforces the sense that this wasn't an isolated event. The sensor didn't catch the beginning. It caught the middle, which means something was already happening before the click. The image was never released officially. It didn't make it into public reports. It wasn't presented as evidence in any specific case. It circulated quietly, almost underground, among people who were already uneasy about the pattern of disappearances. And maybe that's why it was so easy to ignore publicly. A low-quality image, ambiguous, easy to dismiss if you don't want to see. But for anyone who looks closely, it solves one old question and creates another that's even harder. It partially answers why bodies aren't found. And at the same time, it raises something far worse. If someone is removing bodies, this isn't random. It's systematic. A trail camera has no interest in stories. It doesn't build narratives. It records what moves in front of it. And in this case, it recorded something that contradicts decades of comfortable explanations. Something that suggests the forest isn't just a backdrop where accidents happen, but an active space occupied, governed by its own rules. If that image were the only one, an isolated anomaly, maybe it could be brushed aside. But it doesn't stand alone. It exists in a context where hundreds of people have vanished the same way, where scent trails end abruptly, where searches come up empty, where silence repeats. People who saw the file described the same progression of reaction, denial, then curiosity, then discomfort, because accepting what that camera showed means accepting that we may not be the only conscious presence moving along those trails, and that something out there knows very well how to avoid being seen. Right? The camera doesn't lie. In the comments, if you believe devices like that catch more than we're ready to accept, because that's exactly the feeling that starts forming here. What's most unsettling is that this camera was only one of many scattered across similar areas. And if one captured something like this by accident, The question that follows isn't whether it happened only once, but how many times something similar slipped through unnoticed. How many frames were deleted without being seen? How many recordings were ignored because they looked too ordinary to matter? From this point on, the story stops revolving only around disappearances and starts revolving around behavior. The kind of behavior that doesn't match known animals or ordinary human action. Behavior that suggests intelligence, territory, and a deliberate intent to conceal. And when you connect that to the pattern of hikers who enter the woods and never return, it becomes impossible not to see that the trail camera may have captured only a fragment of something, much larger, something that doesn't begin or end in that single frame, but stretches across years, maybe decades, always outside our line of sight. The problem is that after you've seen that image, you can't pretend anymore that everything happening on these trails can be explained away as simple human mistakes, because the camera showed that someone is there when no one should be, and that whoever it is knows exactly what they're doing. What that image shows is too simple to ignore and too complex to explain quickly. There's no spectacle, no explicit violence, nothing that looks staged to shock you. That's exactly what makes it so hard to process. The frame captures a large figure clearly, not human, taking up most of the side of the shot. It doesn't run. It doesn't flail. It doesn't react to the camera. It just moves in a straight line, leaning forward under its own weight, dragging something that doesn't resist. The body is limp. There's no sign of struggle in the moment captured, no attempt to flee, no gesture that shows panic in that specific instant. The most disturbing detail isn't the figure's size or its indistinct look, it's the normalcy of the act. The movement is steady, functional, like part of a familiar routine. No hesitation, no curiosity, just execution. Technically, the image is bad, grainy, slightly blurred, poorly framed. Part of the body is cut off by the bottom edge of the shot. That prevents any comfortable reading. You can't identify a face. You can't confirm defining features. You can't confidently argue the details people usually demand before they'll take something like this seriously. And, strangely, that limitation gives the image its power. It doesn't hand you answers. It forces you to pay attention. The behavior in the frame doesn't resemble a typical animal attack. Known predators behave differently. There's urgency. There's violence. There are scattered traces. Here, what you see is the opposite. The body is being taken off the trail, away from the main path, pulled into the woods, not to be consumed right there, not to be left in the open, but to disappear from the space where it would be found. That changes everything, because it connects directly to the pattern in these disappearances. Hikers who vanish without remains, searches that find no bodies, vast areas combed again and again that stay empty. The image doesn't show chaos. It shows the aftermath, the part almost never considered in official explanations. If you've been paying attention, right? It wasn't an attack in the comments. That one line captures something essential about what this image suggests, without having to say it out loud. Another thing that stands out is how the figure moves through the environment. It doesn't seem lost. It doesn't seem confused. It moves like it knows the terrain. The route isn't random. It doesn't stumble or stop. That suggests familiarity, territory, repetition. For that presence, the forest isn't hostile. It's home. The image doesn't show the beginning. It doesn't show how the body ended up that way. It doesn't show the moment the trail stopped being safe. And that matters, because what's outside the frame carries as much weight as what's inside it. The camera fired too late, when the main action was already underway. That reinforces the sense that this wasn't a single strange moment. The sensor didn't catch the incident. It caught the consequence. There's no sign of urgency either. No attempt to hide from the camera. That suggests something even more unsettling. Maybe that presence doesn't fear being recorded by a basic device, because it understands that one image by itself won't convince anyone. And for a long time, it didn't. If you feel like that detail changes everything about how you see these disappearances, comment. That explains a lot, because from here on out, the numbers stop being abstract. The image also doesn't show explicit violence, and that confuses people who expect something traumatic. But that's where the psychological impact lives. The horror isn't in blood, it's in method, in the idea that someone removes bodies from trails so they won't be found, in the possibility that vanishing isn't a chaotic ending, but one step in a silent process. Some people argue that the lack of clear detail disqualifies the image. But anyone who follows real cases knows genuine records are rarely clean, sharp, or convenient. They're fragmentary, imperfect, hard to interpret. And that's exactly why they linger. They don't give you everything at once. What's most unsettling is realizing the image doesn't contradict the search accounts. It fits them. It explains why scent dogs lose the trail abruptly, why huge areas turn up no remains, why personal items sometimes appear later in unlikely places, as if something decided when and where they should be seen. If you've ever heard stories about trails where nothing is ever found, right, it makes sense now in the comments. That reaction shows up a lot when the pieces start locking together. What the image doesn't show is just as important. It shows no emotion, no rage, no curiosity, no hurry. That pushes you away from the idea of an impulsive attack and towards something functional behavior with a clear objective. Remove what belongs to the human world from human sight. That absence of visible emotion makes it even harder to accept. We're trained to recognize danger through obvious signals, screams, running, violence. Here, the danger is silent, almost procedural. And that challenges how we understand risk in the outdoors. The figure doesn't engage with the camera. It doesn't look toward it. It doesn't react to the click. That suggests the presence of equipment doesn't change its behavior, either because it doesn't notice or because it doesn't care. Either way, the implication is the same. We're not the ones in control. Right? This shouldn't exist if that image hits you the way it hit me. Because that sentence comes naturally when something shatters every familiar category. What the camera recorded doesn't prove everything. It doesn't solve every case. It doesn't name dates or identities. But it changes the central question. It stops being, what happened to these people? And becomes, why do we almost never find what's left? The image suggests the disappearance doesn't end where the trail ends for us. And once you accept that possibility, even partially, the story takes another step. Because if someone is removing bodies, that implies repetition, learning, time. This isn't something that appears once and disappears. It's something that happens while no one is watching. The problem is, that image may only be a fragment, one single capture among thousands of hours of footage never reviewed. With this kind of attention, too small to explain everything, but big enough to change how we see the silence left behind. And that's exactly where the discussion shifts from what the image shows to what it suggests. Because if that behavior exists, then these disappearances aren't isolated failures of the system. They're consequences of something operating outside of it. That's where the story enters an even heavier place. A place where the issue isn't just the disappearance itself, but the quiet return of these presences over time. A return that doesn't leave easy marks, but takes a psychological toll on anyone who chooses to look closely. And to understand how far it goes, you have to take the next step. Because once you accept what the image shows and what it hides, you're left facing the question nobody wants to say out loud. If the bodies are being removed, what happens after they disappear from the trail? After you accept what that image shows, the question that presses in isn't about one isolated case anymore. It's about an entire mechanism operating outside our line of sight. Because when you connect that scene to decades of similar disappearances, the absence of bodies stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like outcome. It isn't that people simply vanish. It's that something makes sure they aren't found. For years, the official explanation has leaned on the idea that nature swallows evidence. Animals scatter remains, weather erases tracks, terrain makes searches difficult. All of that is true to a point. But it doesn't explain the near-perfect repetition of the same result. No bones, no torn clothing, no clear sign of death in hundreds of cases. The forest doesn't erase everything. It hides things for a while, but it almost always gives something back. Here, it stays silent. When you look at the trail cam image through that lens, a hypothesis forms that's too heavy to ignore. Someone or something doesn't just interact with hikers. It acts afterward, not in the moment of disappearance itself, but in what comes next. In the erasure, in the systematic removal of what shouldn't be left exposed. That would explain why scent dogs lose the trail abruptly, not because the scent slowly faded, but because the body was moved. It would explain why vast areas, searched over and over, stay empty, not because nobody went there, but because what went there didn't remain. It would even explain why personal items sometimes show up later in unlikely places, as if something decided when and where they should be seen. If that line of thinking makes your stomach tighten, write, "They erased the traces" in the comments. Because that phrase sums up something nobody wants to admit, but that starts making sense once the pieces line up. The hardest part of that hypothesis isn't the idea of an unknown presence. It's the kind of behavior it suggests. This isn't a chaotic monster acting out of impulse or uncontrolled violence. It's the opposite. What the image implies is method, repetition, territory, a force that treats the forest as its own space and responds to intrusion not with visible attacks, but with quiet correction. That completely changes what Bigfoot represents in this story. It stops being the loud, cartoonish myth people love to mock and becomes something far more unsettling. An old, adapted presence that knows the land intimately and acts to maintain balance in the way it deems necessary, not to be seen, not to be feared, but to continue existing without interference. It also helps explain why true records are so rare, why, when they surface, they're imperfect, why they almost never show direct confrontation. The logic isn't spectacle, it's efficiency. The disappearance doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to be final. In older accounts dismissed for years as folklore, you can find the same core idea, something that takes people who go too far, cross certain lines, fail to realize they've stopped being a visitor. Those stories were always treated like legends. But legends often grow out of patterns people notice over time, even if language twists them. If you've ever heard stories like that, write, "I've heard something like this" in the comments. Because versions of that fear show up across different places, separated by distance and time tied together by the same quiet warning. This idea of systematic removal also reframes the behavior in the trail cam image. There was no attack happening, no urgency. A body was being taken out of the human world, as if the priority wasn't the person, but the trace they would leave behind. As if the real goal was to prevent that disappearance from creating too many questions. And that forces one more uncomfortable possibility into the room. If the presence in that image truly is Bigfoot, then maybe it isn't a typical predator at all. Maybe it's a territorial enforcer, not in a romantic sense, but in a functional one. Something that preserves an invisible boundary we keep crossing. Something that understands that found bodies lead to investigation, curiosity, exposure, and that the surest way to stay hidden is to leave no proof. That kind of behavior requires intelligence, learning, time. It doesn't spring up out of nowhere. It develops. And that, on its own, is more unsettling than any blurry photo. If you feel like that changes everything about how you see these disappearances, right, it's not random, because that's the key. None of this feels random when you view it as a whole. Authorities don't even have to be involved for the silence to hold. It's enough that the official explanation stays soothing to the public. Accident, human error, bad luck. Those words work because they relieve collective responsibility. They let us keep stepping onto trails without thinking. Too hard, but the number of missing keeps rising. Searches keep failing. And every once in a while, an image like that slips out of the dark and throws everything into question, not as definitive proof, but as a sign that maybe we've been looking at the problem from the wrong angle for far too long. The idea that something systematically erases traces also shines a different light on the fear some survivors describe after strange experiences on trails. The sudden silence, the feeling of being evaluated, a sense that taking one more step would be a mistake. Those accounts were always filed away as subjective, but within this framework, they start to look like warnings. Right, the woods warn you if you believe danger doesn't always announce itself in obvious ways. Because that's a truth people learn when they spend enough time out there. If we accept that a territorial force could be operating like this, then these disappearances stop being disconnected tragedies and start looking like part of a silent system of control, a system that doesn't announce itself, doesn't claim anything, doesn't leave clear marks. It just corrects what it considers too much. And that's what makes it so hard to live with. You can't negotiate with something that won't present itself. You can't warn people about boundaries that aren't officially acknowledged. The trails stay open. The maps keep getting printed. People keep believing knowledge is enough to keep them safe. But if this hypothesis is right, then the biggest mistake isn't the recklessness of the people who go into the woods. It's our insistence on believing we fully understand the space we're stepping into. That trail cam image doesn't show a monster attacking. It shows a territory being managed. And when you reach that realization, you understand the most frightening part isn't the disappearance itself. It's that this may have been happening for far longer than we want to imagine, without anyone being able to prove it beyond doubt, because proof requires remains. And remains, if this is true, are exactly what doesn't get left behind. That understanding changes the weight of every missing hiker. It changes what every failed search means. And it sets the stage for something even harder to face: the human cost of carrying a secret like this, even without official confirmation. Because once that possibility settles into your mind, you can't go back to the comfort of simple explanations. And that's exactly where the story moves into its heaviest place. Because accepting that something like this could exist isn't the end of the problem. It's the beginning of a different kind of price, a price that never shows up in reports, but follows anyone who starts looking at the woods, knowing they may not be as empty as they seem. Joan was 32. That number never changed. What changed was everything around it. The days kept passing. The trails stayed open. Other people kept walking into the woods with the same confidence. She had that day, but Joan never came back. No late phone call, no unexpected discovery, no official ending that would tie the story up neatly. The image exists. It was seen. It was looked at. It was ignored. Not because it isn't disturbing, but because it demands a kind of courage most institutions don't have: the courage to admit that something might be happening beyond the reach of accepted explanations. Admitting that would mean rewriting protocols, rewriting public language, rewriting the way we think about safety in places we assume we control. There was no official release, no press conference, no public statement explaining that recording. Silence was the easiest choice. Silence always is. It prevents panic. It avoids hard questions. It dodges responsibilities nobody wants to hold. And meanwhile, the missing person list keeps growing quietly, names eventually turning into numbers in old files. Joan never became a statistic to the people who loved her. She stayed an absence, an empty chair, a message that never got answered, a birthday that comes and goes without celebration. That's the real cost that never shows up in official paperwork, the human cost of never knowing what happened, of never having enough certainty to truly move forward. That image doesn't answer everything. It doesn't name anyone. It doesn't close cases. But it changes something fundamental. It changes the question. The problem was never only whether Bigfoot exists. That part has always been the easiest to mock. The question that matters is different, and it's far more uncomfortable. How many people disappeared because no one wanted to believe what was happening? How many times was a simple explanation chosen, not because it was true, but because it was convenient? How many stories were filed away before anyone really tried to understand them? How many families are still waiting for an answer that may never come, because accepting that answer would mean facing something bigger than we want to face? After you learn Joan's story, after you see the pattern, after you look at that image without trying to soften it, it becomes impossible to return to the idea that all these disappearances are just bad luck or human error. Something shifts, not necessarily in the world, but in how you see it. The forest is still there. Trails are still being walked. Silence is still part of the landscape. The difference is that now, that silence carries another weight. It isn't just the absence of sound. It's the absence of answers. This story doesn't demand fear, it demands attention. Because the greatest danger isn't only what we don't understand, it's what we choose to ignore for too long. And when we ignore patterns, they don't vanish, they deepen. The video appearing on your screen next isn't a continuation of this story. It doesn't focus on Joan or this specific recording, but it reaches into the same hidden space matriarch secrets, quiet forces, and human choices that leave marks that last for generations. A different story, a different situation, but that same uneasy feeling that maybe the distance between us and the unknown isn't as wide as we like to believe. Sometimes the biggest change doesn't come from a final answer. It comes from the moment we stop pretending certain questions don't exist.